She was just 8 years old, barely reaching her father's waist, clutching a faded blue hat in her tiny hands. But in the next few minutes, this small girl would do something that would leave an entire tribe speechless and change the course of two peoples forever. The morning air hung thick with tension as storm clouds gathered overhead like dark omens. Magnolia Voss stood beside her father Boone at the edge of their small settlement, watching as a group of native riders approached through the dusty plains. The tribal delegation moved with purpose, their leader riding at the front with the dignity of someone who commanded absolute respect. Boone's weathered hand instinctively moved to rest on his daughter's shoulder, feeling her small frame trembling slightly, not from fear, but from something else entirely. The 8-year-old had always possessed an unusual ability to see beyond what adults chose to notice, and today her young eyes were fixed on something that made her heart race with concern. Chief Elijah Rhodes dismounted with the fluid grace of a man who had spent his entire life on horseback. His presence commanded immediate attention from every settler who had gathered to witness this unexpected meeting. The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of approaching rain and the weight of unspoken words between two groups who had learned to view each other with suspicion. As the chief stepped forward to address Boone, the first drops of rain began to fall. What started as a gentle sprinkle quickly transformed into something more threatening. The sky darkened further, and the wind intensified, whipping dust and debris across the settlement grounds. That's when Magnolia noticed something that none of the adults seemed to see. The chief's weathered face bore the unmistakable signs of someone fighting against nature's assault. But it wasn't just the rain that concerned her. There was something vulnerable about the way he stood there, exposed to the elements, maintaining his dignity despite the growing discomfort. The little girl looked down at the small blue hat in her hands, the one her mother Cora had made for her just weeks before. It wasn't much, but it was precious to her. The fabric had been carefully chosen, the stitching done with love during long evening hours by lamplight. As the rain began to fall harder, Magnolia made a decision that would astonish everyone present. She stepped forward, away from her father's protective presence, and walked directly toward the imposing figure of Chief Elijah Rhodes. The adults around her seemed frozen in place, uncertain whether to stop her or trust in her innocent intentions. With her small voice cutting through the sound of increasing rainfall, she spoke words that would echo in the memories of everyone who witnessed them. But what Chief Elijah Rhodes did in response to her gesture would prove that sometimes the most profound acts of leadership come not from strength, but from recognizing the pure truth that flows from an innocent heart. The silence that followed Magnolia's approach felt heavier than the storm clouds above. Every eye in the settlement focused on the small girl as she extended her precious blue hat toward the towering chief, her voice barely audible above the increasing wind. "Here, my hat will protect you," she said simply, holding up the small piece of fabric as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Chief Elijah Rhodes stood motionless, his dark eyes studying the child before him. The rain was falling steadily now, soaking through clothing and turning the ground beneath their feet into mud. The other tribal members behind him remained mounted, their expressions unreadable as they watched their leader face this unexpected moment. Boone felt his heart hammering against his chest as he watched his daughter stand there, completely vulnerable, offering something precious to a man whom most settlers viewed with suspicion and fear. But Magnolia seemed oblivious to the tension surrounding her, focused entirely on her desire to help someone who needed protection from the storm. The chief's weathered face revealed nothing of his thoughts as he looked down at the small hat being offered to him. For a moment that stretched like eternity, nobody moved. The rain continued to fall, and the wind continued to howl, but everything else seemed suspended in time. Then something shifted in Chief Elijah's expression. The hardness that had defined his features began to soften, replaced by something that looked almost like wonder. He knelt down slowly, bringing himself to Magnolia's eye level, his powerful frame now dwarfed by the simple honesty radiating from the child. "You would give me your hat?" he asked, his voice carrying a gentleness that surprised everyone who heard it. Magnolia nodded earnestly, pushing the hat closer to him. "The rain is making you cold. Mama always says we should help people when they need it." Behind the chief, several of his tribal members exchanged glances that spoke of their own surprise at witnessing this interaction. They had come here expecting the usual tensions, the careful negotiations that characterized most encounters between their peoples. Instead, they were watching their respected leader engage with a small child who saw him not as a threat or a stranger, but simply as someone who needed help. Boone took a step forward, uncertain whether he should intervene, but something in the chief's demeanor made him pause. There was no danger here, only something profound unfolding between his daughter and this man who commanded such respect from his people. The chief reached out slowly and accepted the small blue hat from Magnolia's outstretched hands. As his fingers closed around the simple fabric, something passed between them that transcended the barriers of age, culture, and the conflicts that had kept their peoples apart. But what Chief Elijah Rhodes did next would not only stun every person watching, it would set in motion a series of events that would change the relationship between the settlement and the tribe in ways that none of them could have imagined. Chief Elijah Rhodes held the small blue hat in his hands for a long moment, his eyes never leaving Magnolia's trusting face. The rain continued to fall around them, but something in the atmosphere had shifted completely. What happened next would be talked about for generations. The chief slowly placed the tiny hat on his head. The sight was almost comical. This powerful, dignified leader of men wearing a child's faded blue hat that barely covered the crown of his head. But instead of looking ridiculous, there was something deeply moving about the gesture. The great Chief Elijah Rhodes, who commanded the respect of warriors and had negotiated with territorial governors, was wearing an 8-year-old girl's hat in the rain. A collective gasp rose from both the settlers and the tribal members. Nobody had expected this. The other natives sat frozen on their horses, their expressions shifting from surprise to something approaching awe. They had followed this man through countless challenges, had seen him face down armed groups and dangerous wildlife, but they had never seen him do anything like this. But the chief wasn't finished. He reached into his leather vest and withdrew something that made every person present hold their breath. It was a sacred feather, one that held deep meaning within his tribe. The kind of feather that was never given lightly, that represented honor and respect, earned through acts of courage and wisdom. "This belongs to you now," he said to Magnolia, his voice carrying across the settlement despite the rain. "Your heart sees what grown people have forgotten how to see." Magnolia's eyes widened as she accepted the feather, holding it carefully as if she understood its importance, even without knowing its full meaning. Her father Boone felt his throat tighten with emotion as he watched his daughter participate in what was clearly a moment of profound significance. The chief rose to his full height again, the small blue hat still perched on his head, and turned to address not just Boone, but every settler who had gathered to witness this meeting. His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being heard and obeyed. "This child has shown me something today," he announced. "She has reminded me that protection comes in many forms, and that the greatest strength is sometimes found in the smallest gestures." The rain was beginning to ease slightly, but nobody seemed to notice. All attention remained focused on the chief, who still wore Magnolia's hat like a crown of honor. The tribal members behind him had dismounted now, their own expressions showing a mixture of respect and curiosity about what their leader might do next. "We came here today to discuss the boundaries between our peoples," Chief Elijah continued, his eyes sweeping across the assembled crowd. "But I think we have discovered something more important than land disputes." The tension that had filled the air when the tribal delegation first arrived had been completely transformed. But what the chief proposed next would challenge everything both groups thought they knew about coexistence, and force them to make a decision that would determine their future for years to come. Chief Elijah Rhodes adjusted the small blue hat on his head and looked directly at Boone Carter. The gesture seemed to transform the entire dynamic of the gathering, turning what had begun as a tense territorial negotiation into something none of them had anticipated. "Your daughter has given me something precious," the chief said, his voice carrying clearly across the muddy ground. "Now I propose we give our children something even more valuable." Murmurs rippled through both groups. Several settlers shifted uncomfortably, uncertain where this unexpected turn was leading. Behind the chief, his tribal members remained silent, but their expressions suggested they were equally surprised by their leader's direction. "What do you mean?" Boone asked, his hand still resting protectively on Magnolia's shoulder. The little girl stood quietly between the two men, clutching the sacred feather she had been given, seemingly unaware that she had become the catalyst for something much larger than anyone had planned. Chief Elijah gestured toward the children visible among both groups, settler children peering out from behind their parents, and young tribal members who had accompanied the delegation. "Let our children learn from each other. Let them see that protection and kindness know no boundaries." The proposal hit the assembled crowd like a thunderclap. Exchange between their peoples had always been carefully controlled, limited to necessary negotiations and trade agreements. The idea of allowing their children to interact freely was revolutionary and potentially dangerous. "You're talking about bringing our children together?" asked Martha, one of the settler women, her voice tight with concern. "How can we be sure of their safety? The same way this child was sure of mine," the chief replied, touching the brim of Magnolia's hat. "Through trust that must be earned, but first must be offered." Boone felt the weight of every eye upon him. As one of the most respected men in the settlement, his response would likely influence how others reacted to this unexpected proposal. He looked down at his daughter, who was examining the feather with wonder, then back at the chief, who still wore her hat, with such dignity. "What exactly are you proposing?" Boone asked carefully. "One day each week, let the children of both our peoples gather at the stream that runs between our lands. Let them learn each other's games, share stories, discover that what they have been taught to fear is simply different, not dangerous." The rain had stopped completely now, but the tension in the air had only intensified. Several of the tribal members were exchanging glances that suggested they were just as uncertain about this proposal as the settlers. This was uncharted territory for everyone involved. Cora Lane pushed forward through the crowd, her maternal instincts clearly at war with her protective fears. And if something goes wrong? If old conflicts resurface? Chief Elijah's expression grew serious as he considered her question. "Then we will face the consequences together, as people who tried to build something better for our children." But what none of them realized was that someone had been watching this entire exchange from the shadows. Someone whose presence would soon turn this moment of potential unity into the greatest test any of them had ever faced. The sound of approaching hoofbeats cut through the thoughtful silence that had settled over the gathering. Every head turned toward the distant ridge where a lone rider was approaching at dangerous speed, kicking up clouds of dust and mud in his wake. Boone's expression hardened as he recognized the rider. Clayton Reeves, a man whose hatred for the native tribes was well known throughout the territory, was bearing down on them with the fury of someone who had witnessed something that enraged him beyond reason. "This is not good," Boone muttered under his breath, instinctively stepping closer to Magnolia. Behind Chief Elijah, the tribal members tensed visibly, their hands moving toward their weapons with practiced readiness. Clayton reined in his horse so hard the animal reared, foam flecking its mouth from the hard ride. His wild eyes took in the scene before him, the chief wearing a child's blue hat, the settlers and natives standing together in apparent harmony, and worst of all, his own neighbors appearing to consider some kind of agreement with people he viewed as enemies. "What in blazes is going on here?" Clayton shouted, his voice carrying the kind of rage that turned reasonable discussions into bloodshed. "Boone, have you lost your mind? You're standing there talking terms with them while they're planning our destruction." Chief Elijah remained calm despite the obvious hostility radiating from the newcomer, but his stance shifted almost imperceptibly into something more defensive. The small blue hat still sat on his head, but now it seemed like a symbol of everything Clayton despised about this unexpected gathering. "Clayton, lower your voice," Boone said firmly. "We're having a peaceful discussion here." "Peaceful?" Clayton's laugh was harsh and bitter. "I've been watching from the ridge for the past hour, and I know exactly what this really is. This is how it starts. They gain your trust with pretty words and children's gifts, then they strike when you least expect it." Magnolia pressed closer to her father, the sacred feather still clutched in her small hands. She could feel the ugly tension that Clayton's arrival had brought to what had been a moment of hope and possibility. "You don't understand what you saw," Cora tried to explain, stepping forward to support her husband. "I understand plenty," Clayton snarled. "I understand that you're all being fooled by a performance designed to make you drop your guard. And I understand that someone needs to show them what happens when they try to manipulate honest people." The chief's warriors had moved their horses into a protective formation behind their leader, while the settlers instinctively clustered closer together. What had been a gathering full of potential was rapidly transforming into the kind of confrontation that could destroy any chance of peace. But Clayton wasn't finished. The rage burning in his eyes suggested he had come here with a purpose that went far beyond disrupting negotiations, and what he planned to do next would force everyone present to choose sides in a conflict that none of them had wanted. Clayton reached into his saddlebag and withdrew a crumpled piece of paper, holding it up like evidence in a trial. His face was flushed with the kind of righteous anger that made dangerous men do irreversible things. "This morning I received word from the territorial governor," he announced loudly, his voice carrying across the now silent gathering. "New orders about dealing with native tribes who venture too close to settled areas." A chill ran through both groups as they realized Clayton was about to weaponize official authority against the peaceful gathering that had been unfolding. Chief Elijah's expression remained stoic, but his warriors shifted restlessly behind him, sensing the threat that was materializing. "Clayton, whatever that says, this isn't the time," Boone said, trying to maintain control of a situation that was rapidly spiraling beyond anyone's ability to manage peacefully. "This is exactly the time," Clayton shot back. "According to these orders, any unauthorized gathering between settlers and tribal groups requires immediate intervention by appointed territorial representatives." He paused dramatically, letting the implications sink in before delivering his crushing blow. "I am the newly appointed territorial liaison for this district, which means I have the authority to end this little meeting right now, and to ensure that no such meetings happen again." The words hit the assembled crowd like physical blows. Several settlers looked stricken as they realized that Clayton now held official power to enforce his personal prejudices. The tribal members meanwhile began looking toward their chief for guidance on how to respond to this unexpected legal threat. Magnolia looked up at her father with confusion written across her young face. She didn't understand the meaning of territorial orders or official authority, but she could feel the fear and anger that Clayton's announcement had triggered in everyone around her. "You can't stop people from talking," she said suddenly, her small voice cutting through the heavy tension. "Mama says talking is how people fix problems." Clayton's cold gaze fell on the little girl, and his expression twisted with something approaching disgust. "Child, you're too young to understand how the world really works. Some people can't be trusted no matter how pretty their words sound." Chief Elijah's jaw tightened at hearing Magnolia addressed with such contempt, but he remained silent, recognizing that any response from him would only escalate the confrontation that Clayton was deliberately provoking. "I'm giving everyone here 5 minutes to disperse," Clayton continued, pulling out a pocket watch with theatrical precision. "The tribal delegation will return to their territory immediately, and the settlers will return to their homes. Any attempt to continue this gathering will be reported as a violation of territorial law." But as Clayton spoke, his horse suddenly shied at something moving in the tall grass nearby. What emerged from that grass would change everything about the confrontation, revealing a danger that made territorial politics seem insignificant by comparison, and forcing bitter enemies to make an impossible choice about who they could trust when everything was at stake. 3 armed men emerged from the tall grass with rifles raised, their faces hidden behind dirty bandanas. The horses of both groups reared and whinnied in alarm as the outlaws positioned themselves to control every escape route from the gathering area. "Nobody move," growled the leader, a scarred man whose eyes held the cold calculation of someone accustomed to taking what he wanted through violence. "We've been watching this little meeting, and it looks like we found ourselves a nice collection of valuable people and horses." Clayton's territorial authority meant nothing to men who lived outside any law. His face went pale as he realized that his official papers and appointed status offered no protection against criminals who recognized no government but their own greed. "The horses, the weapons, and anything else worth taking," the bandit leader continued, gesturing with his rifle toward both the settlers and the tribal members. "Strip off anything valuable and drop it on the ground. Anyone who tries to be clever will regret it." Chief Elijah's warriors tensed, their hands moving instinctively toward their weapons, but the chief himself raised a subtle hand to stop them. 3 armed men in good positions could kill several people before being overwhelmed, and there were children present who could be caught in any violence that erupted. Magnolia pressed against her father's leg, the sacred feather still clutched in her small hand. She could feel the fear radiating from every adult around her, but she could also sense something else, a shared understanding that the artificial divisions between their groups meant nothing when faced with men who threatened everyone equally. "The little girl can keep her feather," the bandit leader said with mock generosity, having noticed Magnolia's frightened grip on the tribal gift. "But everything else of value goes in the pile." That's when something unexpected happened. Clayton Reeves, the man who had arrived intent on destroying any possibility of cooperation between the groups, found himself looking at Chief Elijah with the expression that contained no hatred, only grim recognition of their shared predicament. "How many more of you are there?" Boone asked the bandits, trying to assess their chances if fighting became necessary. "Enough," came the unhelpful reply, "and they're positioned where they can see everything that happens here." Chief Elijah adjusted the small blue hat on his head and caught Clayton's eye. Without words, some kind of understanding passed between them. The territorial liaison who had come to enforce separation between their peoples was now facing the same threat as everyone else, and survival might depend on the very cooperation he had tried to prevent. "We can take them," one of the younger tribal warriors whispered urgently to his chief. "Not without losses we cannot accept," Chief Elijah replied quietly, his eyes never leaving the bandits while his mind calculated possibilities and risks. But what none of them realized was that Magnolia had noticed something about their attackers that the adults had missed, something that might give them the advantage they desperately needed to turn this deadly situation around. Magnolia tugged on her father's sleeve and whispered something that made his eyes widen with sudden understanding. She had noticed what none of the adults had seen. The bandits kept looking nervously toward the same empty ridge, waiting for signals that never came. "They're lying about having more men," Boone whispered to Chief Elijah, who still wore Magnolia's blue hat. "My daughter noticed they keep checking the same spot where nobody is." The realization spread quickly through both groups. The bandits had been bluffing about their backup, counting on fear to control a larger group of people. Chief Elijah gave an almost imperceptible nod to his warriors, while Boone caught the eyes of the other settlers. "Now," the chief said quietly. What happened next was swift and coordinated. The tribal warriors moved with practiced precision while the settlers attacked from the opposite direction. Clayton, despite his earlier hostility, threw himself at the bandit leader with surprising courage. Within moments, all three outlaws were overpowered and disarmed, their threats reduced to empty posturing. "Check the ridge," Chief Elijah ordered, and one of his warriors rode out to confirm what Magnolia had suspected. He returned, shaking his head. There were no other bandits positioned anywhere nearby. As they tied up their captives, something remarkable was happening among the adults. Clayton looked around at the mixed group of settlers and tribal members who had just fought together to protect their children and families. The artificial divisions he had been so determined to enforce seemed meaningless now. "I owe you all an apology," Clayton said, his voice rough with emotion. "I let fear and old prejudices blind me to what was really important." Chief Elijah removed Magnolia's small blue hat and knelt down to return it to her. But the little girl shook her head and pushed it back toward him. "It looks better on you," she said simply. "And besides, now we're friends." The chief's weathered face broke into the first genuine smile anyone had seen from him that day. "Yes, little one, now we are friends." 3 months later, the stream between the settlement and the tribal lands had become a gathering place every Saturday. Children from both communities played together, learned each other's games, and shared stories that their parents were beginning to understand held more wisdom than years of suspicion and fear. Magnolia still carried the sacred feather that Chief Elijah had given her, and she had learned to weave simple baskets from one of the tribal children. In return, she had taught several native children to read English letters using a primer her mother had provided. Clayton Reeves had officially recommended to the territorial governor that the weekly gatherings be supported rather than restricted. His report noted that cooperation between the communities had led to better security for everyone, as evidenced by their successful capture of the bandit group that had threatened the region. Chief Elijah still wore Magnolia's blue hat during important tribal meetings, claiming it reminded him that the greatest wisdom often came from the most unexpected sources. The hat had become a symbol within his tribe of the power that flowed from approaching others with an open heart rather than closed fists. Boone and Cora watched their daughter play with children from both communities and marveled at how a simple gesture of kindness had transformed fear into friendship, suspicion into cooperation, and division into unity. The little blue hat that had started it all was now faded even more from weeks of wear, but its value had only grown. It represented proof that protection comes in many forms, and that sometimes the smallest acts of compassion can build bridges that seemed impossible to construct. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable Western tale, where courage and destiny collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.